Okay, welcome back. We're on page 225 talking about, in a little bit more detail, the first one on the list, the planning schedule management. So there's a bullet list there on page 225 that you really kind of need to look at. So one, it talks about the model development. What model are you going to use? Are you going to use the Agile method and this, that, and the other? So in our case, the most logical place to put the model together is like using a Gantt chart, that kind of stuff. So how are you going to do that? And then the next one they talk about is accuracy and units of measure. In other words, is a unit of measure of day good enough, right? Or does it need to be hours, right? So if you're building a house, do you say, well, it's going to take 17 and a half hours to perform this task, or are you going to say it's going to take 3 days? So what's your tolerance for that accuracy? How much wiggle room are you willing to go? By the way, an awful lot of, if you do this for a living, an awful lot of contracts have built-in procedures for taking care of weather delays. There's a clause in the contract that basically says, you're going to complete the house in 90 days, asterisk, ding, 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 and then the fine print says, unless approved weather delays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are companies out there, you can go out to these websites that says, okay, I'm in Central Texas and it's March. What are my anticipated weather day, if I started in March versus April or June? Okay, so, sorry, back to the stuff. So, your accuracy might change over time. In August, your accuracy might be different than May. Okay. The next one is the thresholds. This is the thresholds for where you get excited. Plus or minus 10% for a particular task. Now, I'll confess, some tasks you probably know in excruciating detail how long it's going to take because you've done this a lot. And others is like, man, I ain't never done that before. I think it'll take 3 days. And so you won't have the same threshold for every single task. This might say, plus or minus 5%, something's wrong. Over here, plus or minus 20%, because I don't have a clue. But some sort of threshold that alerts people. Remember we talked about, it's possible that, for example, if you're managing this thing and you go ask people, how are you doing on phase 3? And the guy goes, yeah, great. You probably need some sort of internal system that whenever you exceed a threshold, that some notification automatically happens. So you don't have to ask the manager, how's he doing on phase 3? Because there's an alert that pops up and says, whoa, you're over 10% off on time or budget or materials or whatever it is. Therefore, something's going on. Proactive management rather than just asking them how they're doing. Okay, continuing. The performance part, how do you plan on measuring performance? If it's a Gantt chart and you're doing a Microsoft project, there's ways you can go in there and, put the progress stuff in there, and that's one way of measuring performance. But you remember we talked about what is the measure of performance? Is it under budget? Is it on schedule? Is it meet the satisfactions of the customer? And the answer is, it kind of depends. So what is your measure? I mean, this particular chapter is all about schedule, but don't lose sight of what the big measure is. How do you plan on measuring the success with regard to scheduling? Reporting. How often are the reports going to be done? Maybe you're going to have a monthly meeting with your bosses to say this project is on schedule, and maybe have a Gantt chart pop up or something. And to whom are you reporting these things? That would be kind of good to know. And then, of course, a list of the project descriptions. Remember we talked about the WBS dictionary? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Whenever you're developing these WBSs, maybe during this scheduling thing, you kind of seem to know other things. You need to have more detail than just say, re-roof or paint or something, if it was a construction project. Okay, continuing. The next one on the list is defining activities, still on page 225. So basically, this is where remember we talked about the scope management in the last chapter? This is where those first WBSs come up. But now, the level of detail in WBSs has to be sufficient where resources and durations are known. That's the key. All right, does that sound like a test question to you guys? The level of detail required now is, I need to know how long it's going to take and what resources are going to take. So that could be 2 levels down. Could be 4 levels down, could be 6 levels down, whatever it takes to know how long it's supposed to take and how many resources are going to be doing. Remember we talked about duration and level of effort, because if I have 8 people, schedules will be like, if I have 4 people working on the project, it'll be like this. If 2 people working on the project, it'll be like that. Okay, so duration and resources being people. Okay, cool. All right, so that's your task here, is to get it down to the point where I can build a schedule. In the planning part, in the scope management part, I don't need to know the schedule at that point. But in order to do a schedule, I need how many people are going to be working and how long is it going to take, those 2 items. So they suggest that you do an activity list. Okay, this is just as simple as it sounds. Just list down all the things that need to be done. And typically, if you remember the discussion about the best practices for doing WBSs, it's by trade or skill. In other words, what does the painter do? Does the painter, for example, tape and float the sheetrock and paint? So does he tape and float and texture and paint? If the answer to those questions is yes, the same crew tapes and floats and textures the wall and paint the walls, you could combine those all together because it's the same responsible party doing it. If not, you don't. I'm not saying you have to. That was just an example. Okay. So a list of activities. And then the activity attributes. And this is just fancy words. Basically, we're talking about the description of the thing. What are the predecessors that has to happen? Before I put the sheetrock on, I need the electrical done. You're not going to be cutting holes in my dang wall to run your wires. The wire's going to have to be in the wall before I put the sheetrock up. Okay? All right. And then lead and lag time, and we'll describe what that means. And then later, they talk about milestones. And milestones, the purpose for a milestone is basically to serve like a punctuation mark in a schedule. This is where a critical thing has to occur, like contract bid opening or contract completion or one of these, inspections. For example, if you've ever built a house, all right, I put the plumbing in the, build pad, put the plumbing in. I cannot order the concrete truck to show up to pour the slab until the plumbing inspectors come back and signed off. And so that's a red letter date. And I might be done, right? I could be done on Tuesday, and the guy don't show up until Friday. And so I'm doing absolutely nothing until that guy shows up. So yeah, a milestone, critical thing in the schedule that requires some attention. Okay, so milestones. And of course, the purpose of the milestone is it's something that you want to measure your performance against the schedule. Okay, the next is the sequencing activities. Okay, now this is all about dependencies, right? You've got all these tasks now, and you need to kind of lay them out in order. And I mean, you could do it on, have a big table, on dining room table, and put 3x5 cards up. Oh wait, this has to go before that one. That kind of stuff. Or you could just use the automation stuff that we've been talking about. But anyway, the idea is you're supposed to be picking those sequences. Okay. So they talk about 3 basic types of these dependencies. All right. So on page 228, they talk about the mandatory. And the mandatories are just those things that just make common sense. For example, I cannot install the software until the software is written. Right? I mean, this is like, duh. I cannot paint the walls until the sheetrock is up. Duh. See, these are just clearly common sense things. No thinking required. The next ones are called discretionary. And discretionary is like, this is the way I want it to be, okay? For example, I want to have all of the sheetrock up in the entire house before I have the guys come and do the tape and float of the sheetrock. I don't have to do it that way. I could have half the house done in sheetrock and the other half not, and have the guy start at this end, but I don't like doing it that way. I like having it set up so all the sheetrock is up, and I've kind of inspected it all, and then they go in and tape and float the sheetrock. It's just my preference, is the way I want it. And quite frankly, it's probably a good reason to do it, for efficiencies and all the rest of that stuff. But it's not required. It's just, that's the way I want it. Okay. And then the other one is external. So Mandatory is those things that just make common sense. Discretionary is like, that's the way I want it to be. And the last one is external. And external is like, okay, the inspector has to improve the plumbing before I can place the slab. I mean, so I don't have any control over that. I mean, I guess I could bribe him with a 6-pack of beer or something, but other than that, it's going to happen when it's going to happen. Okay. So, let's continue. So they talk about how to do sequencing. One of the things they talk about is these things called network diagrams. Now, we saw one when we were talking about, it didn't look exactly like this, but we saw something similar to this when we were doing the Gantt chart thing. So the purpose of this is that this is how you sequence things out, particularly when there's things that could happen simultaneously. So, for example, the numbers here are just arbitrary. This is like task 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't matter what they are. That's not relevant. But this is a day or week, whatever it is. I mean, let's just say it's a day, okay? So this is 1 day to do that, 2 days to do that, 3 days to do that. And then it's going to take me 6 more days to do this, and then I have to have these 2 have to be completed before that one's done, and so you draw all this out. And this is, again, software makes this a lot easier, but you draw out all the tasks and what the activity durations are between all these things. Okay. So, do this on a marker board? Yeah. Do it in software? Yeah. Do it in 3x5 cards? Yeah. Whatever floats your boat. Okay, I don't really care. But these are kind of things that have to happen. You're going to have to know what the tasks are, what the dependencies are, and now, not just dependencies. Now you're going to need to know that, for example, that tasks 2, 3, and 4 could all start on the same date. So it's not just dependencies, it's which ones are in parallel. Okay, cool. All right. So this technique is called the arrow diagramming method. There's even an acronym for it called ADM, although quite frankly I've never used that acronym, but ADM. So the circles, or the nodes as they call them, are the tasks. And then the arrows are the activities and how long it's supposed to take. And now I'll admit that when you're doing one of these diagrams, only those tasks that have dependencies are going to show up on this list, right? Because if it had no dependencies at all, then there's no need to put it on the network diagram. The problem is, the real life is there's very, very few tasks that do not have dependencies. I may have mentioned this in your homework assignment, that maybe 95% of all the tasks are gonna have dependencies. It's almost inevitable that almost all the tasks are gonna have dependencies. With maybe like the first one, right? I mean, come on, the first one's not gonna have a dependencies because it's the one that starts everything going. But you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so there's 2 other things you can do here. They talk about using this arrow diagramming method. There's ways you can influence the schedule, okay? One is called a burst. A burst, and this is kind of crazy, when 2 or more activities are working simultaneously. So there's a burst right in here. To get from 1 to 2, and 1 to 3, and 1 to 4, that's a burst of activity. It's kind of a cool way of saying it, but basically concurrent, okay? They make up their own words. And the other is a merge, where step 5 can't happen until this and that are completed. Okay, cool. So burst and merge, although you could just say concurrent and, well, actually merge is a good one. I am actually merging 2 tasks together. Okay. So that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is called the precedence diagramming method, PDM. Once again, I've never actually used the acronym to do this, but this is the one that you're maybe a little bit more familiar with. This is the one that you've seen in Microsoft Project, or something kind of sort of similar to this in Microsoft Project. But we're coming up on the 15-minute mark, so we'll pick this thing up in just a few.